Okay, whole Bible readers, we've got some really interesting stuff ahead of us in week 45, so let's get right down to it. This week we're going to read Paul's second letter to the Corinthians along with getting started in Galatians. These are two of Paul's most passionate letters, and I think you're going to see the deep feeling that the apostle has for his readers and for the gospel as you read these. Now, first of all, let's realize that with 1st and 2nd Corinthians, we call these 1st and 2nd Corinthians, but there's evidence that Paul wrote some other letters to them. In 1 Corinthians 5:9, he speaks of a previous letter, and in 2 Corinthians 2:4 and 7:8, he speaks of a harsh letter that he had written to the Corinthians. So there may be a letter before 1 Corinthians, and there may have been one in between 1st and 2nd. We might ask, why don't we have those? Well, for whatever reason, the Corinthian church didn't think that those letters, may be very particular and direct to the Corinthians, had value for other Christians in the area and beyond. Early Christians circulated the letters of Paul when they found that they were something that other people ought to read. And so there might be some that were, very authoritative and important for that church, but just immediately related to that church's situation. Well, it's also, by the way, clear that Paul made a short visit to Corinth between 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and we don't have any narration of that in the book of Acts. Well, what is going on in 2nd Corinthians then? Well, we get an idea when we see Paul at the beginning of the letter speaking of the God of comfort, and then in the Thanksgiving section. And then immediately he says, I don't want you to be unaware of what I faced while I was in Asia, meaning while he was in Ephesus on his third missionary journey. Because he said he got to the point where he despaired even of life. Paul was in difficulty, and he was emotionally distraught, even depressed. So this letter is going to be raw, it's going to be honest, and as such, it can be difficult to follow. It's like listening to a discourse of someone who's been in a difficult situation. It doesn't always make sense to the listeners. We have to kind of enter into the situation to understand it. Now, there's an essential paradox of the gospel that is the paradox of 2 Corinthians. As we read in chapter 4, verse 7, we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. And then in verse 17 of chapter 4, this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. Paul is always bouncing back and forth between the difficulties, the hardships, the disappointments, the sadness of being a person in the world who follows Jesus, and at the same time, the resources of God that take us beyond our present situation, that enable us not only to endure, but to hope. And for what we look forward to. In chapter 5, he says, even if we die, even if the worst thing happens, we have a home in heaven. And we're looking forward to the future resurrection when God will reign completely. So what's happening right now? Chapter 6, we are God's temple. And hardships and rebukes that we receive simply lead us to repentance and reconciliation with God. They strengthen our relationship with God as we continue to follow Jesus. Now, chapter 8 and 9, Paul breaks off because on his third missionary journey, he's taking up a collection from his churches, the churches that he started, to take to the Christians of Jerusalem. And so in chapters 8 and 9, he's saying, guys, please make this collection ready, and I want to use the Macedonian Christians, the ones up in northern Greece who are seen as kind of backwards. I want to use them as an example because they don't have a lot, but they've been supremely generous. So think about how they did that, and you should do the same. Then in chapters 10 to 12, Paul is responding to people who are saying, oh, Paul's not much of an apostle. We know super apostles, mega apostles, uber apostles, people who claimed elite spiritual status. And so the point that Paul makes here is that real apostles are lowly. And his life, his resume isn't about achievement, it's about lowliness. And so this is where God says to Paul in the midst of his suffering with a physical malady, chapter 12, verse 9, my grace is sufficient for you because my power is made perfect in weakness. That's another statement that really lies over the whole of 2 Corinthians and the whole of the gospel. Of course, 2 Corinthians 13 ends the book with a final exhortation and a benediction, which is among the most widely repeated benedictions in the New Testament. So good reason to read all the way to the end. Now, what's happening in Galatians? Galatians may be actually the earliest letter of the Apostle Paul. With a lot of others, I think that Galatians was written between Paul's first and second missionary journeys, though it could have been written to the third. It was written to churches in the central part of Asia Minor, today's Turkey, where Paul had established churches on his first missionary journey, who were being faced with the question of Gentile circumcision. Jewish nationalist Christians have come to them saying they've come from the apostles of Jerusalem. They hadn't. And saying you've got to make Gentiles be circumcised so they can be Christians. And Paul's aim here is to say, no, God's purpose has always been to save people by faith. This is what he has done from the beginning. Jesus is the seed of Abraham who fulfills God's promise to bless all the nations. So this is a book which is a lot like Romans, and it's going to take us ultimately into some discourse that's going to show us not just why we live in unity, but how the Spirit empowers us to live in unity. Okay? Great reading this week, just some really fascinating stuff. Enjoy your experience in this week's reading.